We have a treat in front of us now for a religious perspective on the misuses of power. Peter Gomes is an American Baptist minister and a preacher of uncommon wit and wisdom. He's also a friend of mine, so I could go on and on about him, but I think most of us know that he's the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals, teaches in FAS and the Divinity School, and the Pusey minister in Memorial Church. He's got a number of highly intelligent and intelligible and digestible books, including Strength for the Journey, The Good Life, Truths That Last in Times of Need, and The Good Book, Reading the Bible with Mind and Heart. What you might not know about Peter is that he's an actor as well as a preacher, or maybe they're one and the same, although this preacher has actually played the role of God. He's a musician, a talented musician, and a conductor. The thing that I love the most about him is that he's also a fan of the WWF, and that's not the World Wildlife Federation, but it's the World Wrestling Federation. He's an avid fan of professional wrestling. And he was also featured in the premiere issue of Talk magazine, Tina Brown's publication, as one of America's best talkers, in an article entitled, "A Big Mouth We Hope Never Shuts Up." With that, Peter.
I should hasten to say that my best role was not the role of God, it was the role of Julia Child. And I had a marvelous time. It was great fun. Ira and I go back 2 presidents, and not of the United States, but of Harvard. That's how Harvard people measure time, by our presidents, not yours. And so we are firmly bound together, and I'm happy to be here. I'm not altogether sure why I was here, because it talks about misuses of power, leadership and the misuses of power. I've never had any power. I perhaps have had some influence from time to time, but I haven't had any real power. You're in the power business. I'm in the influence business. Your business of power is very visible and has immediate and significant effects. I'd like to think that my influence lasts long after your power has expired. But I don't want to be theological or metaphysical here, but I mean, that is what I do. And you wouldn't expect me to do anything else, I assume. I first misread the title. I thought it was Misuses of Clerical Power, and I thought that you wanted me to yet have another bash at the Roman Catholic Church, and I decided maybe that's not what you had in mind, that you actually wanted a perspective on the misuses of power from the point of view of a cleric. And whether that's what you want or not, that is what you're going to get, because that's the last thing to which I turned my mind. We in the clergy, I think, are remarkably prone or tempted to misuses of power, because we are very much aware that we are engaged in an ultimate business. You are in various forms of managerial activity and entrepreneurial activity, but we clergy compensate ourselves, because no one else does, with the happy notion that ours is an infinite business, therefore dealing with ultimate things, which therefore can give us license to venture into realms that others might not do. The old statement, angels venture, a fool's venture where angels dare not tread, does not include the clergy, I hasten to say. Now, I want to illustrate 2 points. I'll use 2 illustrations to make one point about one of these problems, and I'm trying to go by the questions that are listed on page 2 You have asked the speakers and panelists to address the following questions. How is power most frequently misused in the domain with which you are most familiar? What are the reasons that typically underlie such misuse? Have any attempts been made to address the problem? If yes, what are they, and how effective have they been? If no, why not? And what do you consider might be promising correctives? That's a pretty clear outline, and I plan to follow it. Now, let me begin with an account of the Second Vatican Council, where among the principal Americans present, of course, were Cardinal Cushing of Boston and Cardinal Spellman of New York. And the Holy Father, the sweet and genial and much blessed John the 23rd, frequently mixed these two American cardinals up. I don't know how you could mix Cardinal Cushing up with the Cardinal Spellman, but it was possible to do. And each time the two cardinals politely corrected the Holy Father and explained that they were not the one he thought they was. And then he sort of did it the third time, and Cardinal Cushing explained to him that he was Cushing of Boston and this was Spellman of New York, and the Holy Father apologized profusely, and Cardinal Cushing says, "That's all right, Holy Father, no man is infallible." Now, that's part of our problem, because not all of us are popes, but all of us do have a pretension to infallibility, and that is one of the risks in my profession, that even though we may not know a great deal about whatever it is we are talking about, we presume to talk in the voice of God. And you don't get any bigger or better than that. You might speak for Harvard or some big corporation or the United States government, for heaven's sakes. That's all well and good. But some country preacher standing on a stump who claims he has not only the ear of God, but the voice of God, not to mention the mind of God, trumps you at every moment. And that tends to, if not carefully moderated, lead to a kind of professional arrogance that can be all the more dangerous depending on the degree to which people actually listen. Now, to show you that I am an equal opportunity a discriminator, there was a wonderful story of Adam Clayton Powell, the great pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, who had a day job in the United States Congress as a Democratic representative. And he enjoyed his day job, I think more than he did his Sunday job, because he spent more time on his day job than he did on his Sunday job. But every Sunday before an election, whatever Sunday it was before the first Tuesday in November, Adam was in his pulpit at the Abyssinian church with thousands of people in the congregation, and invariably he would say, "Now, it is not for me to tell any of you for whom you should cast your vote on Tuesday. That is a matter between you and your conscience, and you should not listen to any man to tell you what to do. This is a sacred American privilege for which our ancestors fought and bled and died, and I want you to keep this foremost in your mind. Don't listen to what anybody tells you to do, but God wants you to vote the straight Democratic ticket." And invariably they did, and by and large, I'm grateful that they did. But from both sides of this, there is a kind of misuse, or at least a tendency to misuse, a natural influence that is accorded people in my profession. Part of it has to do with cultural deference on the ground that we do, in theory, know more about spiritual and religious matters than the rest of you do. And part of it has to do also with the fact that spiritual and religious matters, whether we like it or not, are big deal items, big ticket issues in our culture. And therefore, a kind of unnatural deference in a pluralist and secular culture is nevertheless given to the clergy. And the great question is, how do we use the influence that comes our way? How can we be trusted with the power that comes our way? And if you doubt that we have this influence or power, just note where candidates for the presidency tend to pop up on Sundays as they're running for president, first in the primaries and then in the general election. They genuinely find themselves in some church and wish to be seen seen coming in or going out. And, you know, if they're Bill Clinton, they're on the platform, they're singing all the verses, they're hugging everybody in the choir, and there is a kind of intimate association, wanting to be seen in the company of people whose influence is regarded as important. One of the things that most outraged certain conservative Republicans in the late and unhappy impeachment proceedings against President Clinton was that he was photographed coming out of Foundry Methodist Church with his wife and Bible in hand, obviously having been at divine service, and on his way home to a documented tryst in his inner office, as if sex and religion don't go together. We know they do, they should, and they both come from God. But that sequence was a rather unfortunate one in the minds of at least Henry Hyde. So there is this notion that power and religion are heap big medicine, and those who are the practitioners of religious power and religious influence, especially in our culture, have both an opportunity and a responsibility. Very few other countries do you see this. I would say the only other countries where you see this conspicuous influence between the clergy and policy are in Islamic republics. Now, ministers are not mullahs, but the relationship between the culture and the content of a particular set of religious convictions and those who represent those convictions is remarkably similar between our iconic religious culture in the United States and the kind of Islamic culture in Islamic republics, where indeed Islamic law, the religious law, is in fact the law of the land. The very thing that Mr. Rumsfeld and friends are desperately trying to avoid in Iraq, but which I think, not as a great analyst, but just reading the papers, I think it is inevitable. And sooner, indeed, rather than later, we will be faced with a de facto, if not de jure, Islamic republic in that spot. And then we will have something to contend with that we could not have imagined before. But I digress. In England, for example, where the Church of England is by law established as the Church of the land, and Her Majesty the Queen is the supreme governor of the Church, and the Prime Minister is the person responsible for recommending bishops to Her Majesty, no politician running for office would be caught dead in church. Perhaps that's the only place they would be caught, under the only circumstances in which they would be there. There is no sort of public benefit to be seen to be religious in Britain on the part of politicians. In fact, one might argue no reason to be religious on the part of anybody, since fewer than 1% are found at least once a year attending a service in the Church of England. Perhaps if you've attended a recent service in the Church of England, you understand why. But again, I digress. It's only in our country, and partly to do with events not far from where we're standing today in the 17th century, where religion is understood to be of such significance that those who are its professors and chief practitioners have an influence in some respects out of all proportion to their capacity to make wise and sound judgments. When John Winthrop landed off the Massachusetts coast in 1630 on the good ship Arbella, he wrote what I have called on many occasions the most significant and perhaps the most neglected public document in American history. I would argue of more influence ultimately than either the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, and as a boy from Plymouth I concede of even greater influence than even the Mayflower Compact. That was his sermon called A New Model of Christian Charity, in which he used from the New Testament phrases that have been engraven in our cultural consciousness. The city, we shall be as a city set on a hill. People think John Winthrop wrote that, or better still, they think Ronald Reagan wrote that, and maybe he did for John Winthrop. But the fact of the matter is, it was Jesus who said it in the New Testament on the Sermon on the Mount, and setting the civic ideal, and the civic ideal upon which Massachusetts Bay and by and large the rest of the country were established was this sort of mutual parity and respect for the civil and the religious orders. On the notion that the civil order was designed to provide a stable environment for the religious environment, and the religious environment was designed to preserve good order in this life and the promise of prosperity and satisfaction in the life to come. They were meant to balance one another. The notion of either strict opposition or strict separation is a considerably later idea, not one that has, in many respects, won popular affection. All of this history is to suggest that the place deserved not which the clergy hold in our public discourse goes back a very, very long way, is deeply ingrained in our culture, and in many ways has much to answer for. Lord Acton is right, especially insofar as the clergy are concerned. And the accumulation of power, or influence more so in our case, is both a dangerous and a splendid opportunity. The splendid opportunities we all know. Even though in January, when we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, most people, probably including your students and colleagues, think of Martin Luther King as a social innovator who led a great cause for social justice and freedom, and who, by the way, from time to time functioned as a preacher. Even the I Have a Dream speech is thought of as a speech and not as a sermon. And most people have succeeded remarkably well in secularizing the civil rights movement, which really was, if you look at it carefully, a religious crusade with a very good law department. That is what the civil rights movement was. And if it had depended alone upon the army of lawyers that had been working since World War I and Thurgood Marshall and his splendid crew, if it had depended upon them alone, it may very well still be in the courts. But it didn't depend on them alone. It was a religious movement, and it appealed fundamentally not to our sense of justice, which is a dangerous reed upon which to depend in this country. It depended upon our sense of righteousness and guilt. It drew upon our common sense of religious identity, and King played, prayed, and preached into that in such a way as to change not only the laws, but indeed the hearts and minds. And that is what religious power at its very best can do. But there are, of course, ample negative examples of this as well. Those of you who know anything about your American social history will remember the fearsome name of Father Charles E. Coughlin. Father Coughlin was known as the radio priest in the 1930s. Had an enormous influence. He probably at a time, about 1934, 35, the most influential non-political factor in the United States. He had a weekly radio show from the Shrine of the Little Flower in Royal Oak, Michigan. Now a footnote in religious, political, and broadcasting history, but in those days, a force to reckon with. And he was a great advocate for social change and for social justice, and thousands, millions of people who were not Roman Catholics, for example, listened to Father Coughlin because he talked sense, so it appeared. He made sense. He mastered the medium just as Franklin Roosevelt had mastered the medium. Father Coughlin began to mount his own social program and his own social agenda, which began to run sort of contrary to President Roosevelt. His endorsement of a candidate was considered absolutely essential. And all was well with Father Coughlin until he began to turn increasingly anti-Semitic, and the Roman Catholic authorities pulled his program and pulled him eventually, and he sank into obscurity from which he has not yet emerged, except for a few doctoral studies here and there. But at his time, in his moment, more so than Billy Graham in a recent generation, or Reinhold Niebuhr in an earlier generation, Father Coughlin was a big deal. And the reason he was a big deal was, frankly, because of the authority of his office as a priest, and not because of his social analysis. Now, the reasons that begin to undo this kind of influence is the reason adduced in my earlier illustration. If you speak in the name of God and you believe you're doing God's work and you want God's work to be your own, eventually, if you're not very careful, you become to think of yourself as God. Not as God's ambassador or God's representative or God's diplomat or God's servant, but God. And therefore, since there's nobody to contradict you, since God does not necessarily come down and say, not you, but you can get away literally with murder. You can fool a lot of the people a lot of the time. Most of you know that in your own professions, I'm sure, and have advanced with some considerable benefit from that axiom. But eventually you will be exposed, and somebody else will come to take your place. But in the clergy, the risk of being susceptible to your own demons is not often recognized until it is too late. And there is a sense in my profession that the more we appear to be marginalized from what the world perceives as, quote, real power, the banks, the international conglomerates, the elite universities, and the levers of power in the economy, the more we seem to be marginalized from that, the more we attempted to claim extraterrestrial power, as it were, and to regard ourselves as, if not infallible, pretty close to the one who is infallible. And therefore the message that we communicate may often not be the one from the one who sends us, but our own. And we need this added advantage to compete with you, who are not inhibited by any authority beyond that of either the bottom line or the next election. Now, your questionnaire asks, have any efforts been made to address the problem? I think the answer, at least from my profession, is not very many. Who's going to do it? Each clergy is eager to obtain and attain the same degree of success as somebody else, or more so. So only to the degree that one will take it from X and appropriate it for Y is there a sort of built-in judge or monitor of our use of power and our cultivation of influence. And so in some sense, the self-policing powers of the clergy are not very persuasive. Just look at the Catholic bishops and their attempt to deal with the scandal of pedophilia. Indeed, they have done the best that they could, and I believe what they have done is, in fact, the best that they can, considering the nature of the clergy, not to mention its highest office of bishop. It is just very hard to distrust not only your own motives, but those of your brethren in the same enterprise. And so one of the things that has brought the bishops to book, in some sense, is, and I have to give them credit for recognizing this, is the intentional involvement for the first time at a significant level of a discerning, and one might even say skeptical, laity. It is the involvement of what I would call lay skepticism that somehow helps keep the clergy on balance. And it may yet work, though it has not yet worked to a great deal of satisfaction. But it was the only resource available. Appeals to the Holy Father were not particularly helpful, and even less so to the Curia in Rome, which still lives in a certain kind of medieval miasma as far as all of this is concerned. And we know what happened when these matters were left to diocesan bishops. The bishops, I think, in their councils widely said that they needed a countervailing force, not the civil law, but the informed skepticism of lay people. Now, it's not that lay people themselves are infallible, but there is a countervailing force between the laity and the clergy that at least helps. This, in theory, is a principle that Protestants learned a long time ago, but have not practiced themselves with a great deal of regular or conspicuous success. But it remains an ideal, and it appears to be working. The promising corrective you ask for in all of this, both clergy misuse of power and the clergy perception of the misuse of power everywhere, is, in my sense, what one might call, for lack of a better term, courageous modesty or modest courage. Modest is an important word here. It is a word that encourages us not to mistake our means, whatever they may be, for the end, and not to confuse our ends with the end. So that it's a becoming modesty that says it is not on every topic and at every moment that we are called upon to speak and pronounce. We are not infallible. We are human beings. We are subject to the same passions and temptations that everybody else is. And when we do see wrongdoing or malfeasance or whatnot, we have to also remember that those on whom that spotlight shines are also the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, and equally susceptible to foul deeds and misdoing. That's the modesty sort of side of it. We will never know entirely. We must always proceed with a degree of caution. But on the other hand, the operative word is courage. The operative word is courage. That is to say, we do have a responsibility, both within our own profession as clergy, to address the matters of the day that cry out for addressing, and in our vision of what we believe the beloved and the ideal community, the city set on a hill, should be. We have a responsibility to speak out in favor of what we believe to be the true, the just, the good, and the beautiful, and against what we believe to be wickedness in high and in low places. When people say that the clergy are beginning to meddle in politics, what they usually mean is that they're offering a political opinion with which you do not agree. That's the kind of meddling that is usually introduced. When the clergyman endorses your campaign or contributes to your particular cause or signs up for your board, you say he or she is socially relevant and exercising a proper public responsibility. But when they call you to book as a malingerer or a malefactor or somebody who's doing less than they ought to, you say, Reverend, stick to your good book and good life and leave the real world to us. I mean, the answer to that is we have left the real world to you, and look at the mess that it's in. You have had unfettered access to all the influence and power in the world, and you've not done very well by it. Many, many years ago, when I was a young Plummer professor of Christian morals, my old friend Graham Allison called me up and he said, we're going to break ground for the first building of the Kennedy School. And so I came down, there was a big hole over there, and I said a few words, and 9 months later, up rose an enormous building. And 5 times I've come down here, big holes in the ground, out of which arise enormous buildings all over the place. And I ask you, are we safer today than we were when I began this exercise? The answer is no, but it gives you all something to do, and that is very important. I understand that. But I think if I call for a becoming modesty in the divinity school, which, because it's poor, is naturally modest these days, the becoming modesty is even more important in a place like this, which is rich in power, rich in potentiality, rich in connections, and also rich in the notion that you actually can do some good. You can't do as much good as you would like, and in the effort to do a lot of good, sometimes you might actually do some serious harm because you have influence, you have power, people will listen to you. There is nothing worse than the misuse of power in a good cause. That is the ultimate satanic formula, it seems to me. I, for example, do not think that Wolfie, Rummy, and Condi are wicked, evil, or perverse people. Nor are they stupid people. They are very smart people, very bright people. And I respect that. And they're also incredibly powerful people. And I actually believe what they say they believe, that they are, in the words of a famous Presbyterian, determined to make the world safe for democracy. Remember what happened to him, unfortunately. That's Woodrow Wilson, for those of you who have not taken American history. I believe what they say, but I also believe that in the name of good things, terrible things often happen. Unanticipated, not in the syllabus, incalculable. And the more power you have to pursue your vision, your goal, and your opportunity, the greater is the risk that if you get it wrong, you've got it terribly wrong. And the rest of us have to sort it out as best we can. So modest courage, courageous modesty may well be, in the long sense, among the wisest precepts that anybody who pretends to leadership should aspire to. I worry about presidents, either of the university or the United States, who spend a great deal of time in prayer. Not because I'm opposed to prayer, but because once they finish, they feel that they have a direct line and a clear mandate. Charles I is famous for saying there was nothing more dangerous than a Presbyterian fresh off his knees. And I believe he knew what he was speaking about. Somebody said that Jimmy Carter spent an awful lot of time in prayer, and somebody said, well, if he'd spent less time in prayer and more time doing other things, things might have turned out differently. Direct lines to the divine throne are always rather difficult. One should expect the line to be interrupted, and when it is interrupted, it is at that point that a certain modest discernment and the necessary courage to act in the absence of a clear mandate is what, in my view, moral leadership is all about. The Bible is full of superb moral leaders who didn't get it right or didn't get it all right, and who, if they thought they had it all right, people like David, got it very, very wrong. And even people like Paul, St. Paul, who's no small ego at all and could flourish here at Harvard, recognized the ambiguity of power, influence, and leadership. So for me, in my profession, it seems to me the courageous modesty and modest courage are the elements, together with a commitment to comment and a reliance upon the long-term skepticism of an informed laity, provide the formula for helping us to get from this life to the next. And ultimately, that's my goal. I don't live in an election cycle. I live in a cycle from this world to the next one. And whether you believe you do or not, you do. So it might be useful for you to think about that as well. And on that note, I will stop. I'll answer any question on any subject. It doesn't have anything to do with what I've said or what you're interested in. But I will only say this, that the less I know, the longer the answer will be. But I'm prepared to comment on anything. So what do you want to know about? Yes, sir.
When you talk about the misuses of power, the abuse of power in the name of good, in the name of good, you drew immediately from modern American politics and the people prosecuting the war in Iraq. But I immediately went to the thousands of years of missionary activity, of generations of children taken from their families at the age of 6 into residential boarding schools, Anglican and Catholic, across North America.
Are you from Australia by any chance?
No, I'm not. No, I'm from California.
All right. Same principle.
Yeah. And so when you speak of the ease with which people can institutionalize a sort of arrogant grandiosity, can you speak to the kinds of humble reflections that you would recommend or that you have tried to institute within amongst your clerical colleagues in regard to rethinking the nature of mission?
It's very hard to institute humility among the clergy. And almost as difficult as it is among politicians and business people, but it's very hard among the clergy. And I certainly do not in any way disavow the dangers and the wickednesses that have been done in this world in the name of religion, because we ran the world for so long. We have a disproportionate share of responsibility, it seems to me, for the way we prosecuted in the name of God and good our particular mission. They say in Africa that the missionaries came with the Bible and the Africans had the land. The missionaries said, "Let us pray," and it turned right around, and when they woke up, the missionaries had the land and the Africans had the Bible. We recognize that. But on the other hand, we also recognize that missions tend to follow the flag, and the flag follow missions. So you can't blame all the world's troubles on the missionaries who simply opened the door. There are a fairly healthy number of good old secularist capitalists who walked through that door and made the most of the opportunity as well. So there's enough guilt to go around. All you have to do is think off the coast of where you come from and the great depredation in the name of God and country that was done in the kingdom of Hawaii. I'm always ashamed and embarrassed when I go to Hawaii as a New Englander and an American, because until modern times, I cannot think of a more reprehensible act of public policy executed in behalf of our people on those people. And it's a source of great shame. But that was not purely Christian missionaries with infected blankets. That was also the Dole family. And it was also much of the wealth of San Francisco and Los Angeles, and a lot of American investors who deposed, talk about regime change, who deposed the legitimate monarchy to install the board of directors of various pineapple companies. I mean, that's a pretty wicked business and a terrible conspiracy. But there's an aphorism I learned many years ago, which I try to apply to myself, and I think may be a direct answer to your question, and that is this: which is more dangerous, a surplus of virtue or a surplus of vice? Which is more dangerous? Well, the correct answer to the question, or at least the interesting answer, is a surplus of virtue is far more dangerous than a surplus of vice. Why? Because a surplus of virtue is not subject to the constraints of conscience. So if you think you're doing the right thing for the right cause in the long run, and ultimately it'll all turn out all right, you allow yourself incredible liberties, because you've got to break eggs to make omelets. There have to be a few difficulties in order to get to the solution. Whatever it takes in the short run is ultimately justified in the long run. And that is the basis of so much of our both personal and our public policy. And so when I say one should be cautious about that or modest about that, I'm reminded of that aphorism. Most of the wickedness that I know of as a historian, most of the wickedness in the world has been perpetrated in the name of good. Not necessarily in the name of God, but they're connected, but in the name of good. Even Adolf Hitler, from his perverted seat of logic and reasoning, believed he was doing what was good for Germany. And from a certain German point of view, it may well have been indeed, but a lot of wickedness, the most vivid examples of which are too easy to remember right now, were prosecuted in that. And so what it means to me is with power and the opportunity to exercise it and a grand moral vision comes a concomitant modesty and a wariness that doesn't lead to inaction, but leads to a degree of modesty and humility which is usually not found at the core of our policy making. So I take full responsibility for the religious dimension of that, but that was simply a means to a much larger end in which all of us participate today, and I'm not going to take all the heat, because you share in it just as much as I do. I hope that's a helpful response. What else? Yes?
Would you identify yourself, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
My name is Lindy. My name is Lindy Miller. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. And you mentioned that there's not necessarily a check on the clergy. And I'm wondering, it would seem to me that those who can check it perhaps come from within, those who go through seminaries and then decide not to practice as clergymen or clergywomen. And I'm wondering what kind of training is being done now in the seminaries to sort of encourage this modest courage?
Very little that I know of, I'm sorry to say. We have, it's fascinating to me. My colleague Preston Williams is the venerable professor, now emeritus of ethics in the Divinity School, but I think he would support me in the view that in the days when, in the 70s and 80s, in the days when professional schools suddenly realized that there were crooks and malefactors in their midst, they all began to institute these ethics programs. Usually they were rather abstract cases dealing with other people, never themselves, and they were usually add-on modules, not at the center of the curriculum, but they were there. The business school, John Shadd invested a huge amount of money to develop an ethics program over there. Ethics in the professions is a big deal here at Harvard. The one place where we don't do that is in the Divinity School. And I suppose part of it is a certain kind of moral arrogance which we don't acknowledge, even because we are so modest, is that we don't need to do this because we are God's servants and God's people, and this is not an issue as it would be for a person in the business school or the Kennedy School or the law school. I don't know if there's an ethics program in the School of Design. There ought to be. They have a lot to answer for, it seems to me, but that's another story. And the School of Education, they work on trying moral education. Harvard College, Derek Bach was so horrified at Watergate and the fact that most of those crooks were Yale graduates and needed some attention that he instituted here in the college the moral reasoning program. But the moral reasoning program is essentially about goodness, not how should I be good or what is bad or evil in me, wicked in me. Now, in the Divinity School, we Christian Protestants have the great helpful doctrine of original sin, which at its best says, we're all guilty, and our fingers are always in the cookie jar. But at its worst, it sort of says, well, because that's the fact of life, we live in a fallen world, let's get on with it. I don't see a great deal of interior thinking in theological education at this point, and it's certainly a field in which we need some attention. A small illustration of the dilemma, which is addressed in some of the Episcopal seminaries, for example, is what may seem to you the small business of plagiarism. But everybody would like to be able to rely on the authenticity of the sources that they use and are attributed. And if you don't tell the right people who has written the right case and you attribute something to yourself that belongs to somebody else, that is intellectual thievery of a serious dimension. There's a lot of plagiarism in the clergy. Saturday night, 11 o'clock, priest has been out all day, working hard, sermon due the next morning. One of the easiest things you can now do is just dial up on the internet and see what somebody has said on the text that you have to deal with tomorrow, and in a few minutes, it's yours. And usually what's on the internet is not very good in the first place, so the sin is compounded by the fact that you're stealing bad material and passing it off as your own. But it's done. It's done. And every once in a while, some notable clergyman gets caught, and then there's a great hue and cry about what can be done about this. Usually they're fired and an inquiry is made. But that's a level that we can address and are beginning to address. I don't know anything about Roman Catholic theological education, but I suspect at this point in the seminaries there's a great deal of discussion going on about how to address the circumstances that permitted the pedophilia scandal and what can be done to prevent that in the rising generation of priests. I assume, I don't know this, but I assume that that's what's going on. But by and large, I am not confident that the theological institutions are of their own capable of focusing on malfeasance or misdoing in the profession. I suspect that both through historical analysis and contemporary events, we will be forced to do that, and that's only to the good. But I would have to say that I think we are probably behind most of the other major professions. The medical profession with that marvelous oath and that great sense of professional responsibility, would on the one hand appear to be at the forefront of this, but next to the clergy, the doctors have the greatest theory of infallibility. And so it's very hard for them as a profession to think that anything that we do could be less than what God wishes to be done. I mean, there are some egregious cases of this, but happily, most of us still think of those as exceptions rather than the rules. We still have a sort of implicit trust of the doctor. I used to say the family doctor, but he or she doesn't exist anymore. But you put on a white coat and a thing around your neck, and there's an implied trust there and an ultimate kind of authority that has made that profession both honored and, to a large degree, self-policing. But to use my Protestant analogy, we live in a fallen world. There's nobody exempt from, or ought to be exempt from, scrutiny both within and without. And if there is a profession where the abuse of power is readily seen, it may very well be in the medical profession. There is a joke that illustrates there's a cafeteria line in heaven, and a new person comes up, and they're standing in line patiently waiting to get their food, and somebody cuts out of the line and goes right to their head. And somebody said, "Who the hell is that?" And the answer is, "That's God, and he thinks he's a doctor." So there is a kind of, I'll stop on that. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Claudia Thompson. I'd like to hear more about how you see the laity relationship collaboration being effective, because that struck a chord with me, and I think that it makes sense that the interplay between the profession, as you're just talking about it, and those who it's responsible to could be an effective partnership. And I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on that and any way you can use that analogy to think about it in a broader context.
Okay, thank you for that. Very helpful opening on this subject. The reason that there has historically been this great deference to the clergy over the generations is that the laity simply weren't smart enough. They didn't know what was going on. This was an uninitiated horde dealing with a group of specialists who had their ultimate destiny in their hands. And you defer to the high priest, you defer to the shaman, you defer to the person who can do the magic, and that makes perfect sense. But as the sort of rising tide of consciousness and education embraces more and more people share their sense of their destiny is not in the hands of the priest. Their destiny is in their own hands, aided, facilitated, and directed by the priest. They now have a stake in preserving the very best of the traditions and of helping to articulate the nature of their own faith. It means, in my view, that laity have to assume more and more responsibility, not for policing the clergy, but for actually taking some responsibility for their own spiritual lives, and simply not deferring or depending upon a professional set of people to do it all for them. Oh, Father will take care of this, or that's the reverend's business, or whatnot. And so as this rising tide of consciousness and concern develops, my model would be of the laity who see themselves in league with, in the best sense of the word, with the clergy. They're in this together. There are some people who devote full time to this work, and they are the clergy, but it's the same work to which all of us are devoting the substance of our lives. Martin Luther, way back when, used to talk about the priesthood of all believers, and the notion that everybody is a priest, whether you're ordained or not. And therefore, everybody, if you follow that principle, has the same responsibility, if not the same degree of activity, in the well-being of the religious community and of the well-being of the individual. So one of the things, for example, we note in the Roman Catholic economic crisis in the Archdiocese of Boston, the closing down of parishes and whatnot, and grave anxiety. I understand the emotional attachment people have to a piece of real estate, the place where their ancestors were buried and where they were married, and St. Euales is a big deal in our family's life. But to a Protestant, the answer to that question is very simple. If the archdiocese can't afford enough priests to staff every parish, and every parish wishes to think of itself as viable, the viability does not depend upon the priest. The viability depends upon the engaged, the informed activity of the parish, to which priests and deacons may lend a particular expertise and skill, but the spiritual health of that community does not depend entirely upon the ministrations of one man. It's an empowerment of the people. Now, the only time the people were prepared to take on that empowerment when they felt that they were threatened or their well-being was challenged in some sense by the recent scandal. But it seems to me that that was an opportunity, an unfortunate one, but an opportunity which ought to help redefine the nature of the laity and the nature of lay and clerical partnership in leadership. Now, it's not all as rosy as it might be, because the other side of the case is rather vivid in our own American history. I've read an awful lot of history about Christians in the South in the days of segregation. A brave, noble clergyman, a sort of Atticus Finch type in the clergy, who saw the pernicious errors of segregation and didn't dare speak out because he'd be lynched by his own people. So it was a heroic and noble clergyman against a secure, powerful, and very conservative, even reactionary congregation, which meant that that couldn't work. So it's not a monolithic exercise on each side, but I'm suggesting that the new model which ought to obtain, which both corrects clergy abuse and empowers the people, and one hopes, therefore, anticipate and corrects congregational abuse, is an increasing lay engagement, which begins with a certain degree of skepticism. That is to say, neither he nor we have all the answers, but together we might be in an opportunity both not only to preserve the church or the local community, but to transform it into something else. And that may, in the long run, be the best possible way through all of this.
We have time for one last question. Would you go?
Sir.
Thank you.
Bird, I graduated in 2003 from the Kennedy School. I'm wondering what is the effect on leaders in the church when they find that other members of their church have done things that are wrong, and they themselves are not directly responsible? What's the effect of them as leaders, and how do they maintain their moral authority to be able to lead others, especially when their laity, as you put it before, are disappointed and injured by things that have happened in their church?
Oh, like Jim Baker, for example, or what's that other guy down there? Jimmy Swaggart, who has been forgiven, restored, and piling it in now again. Well, I think there's a cycle when that happens. When there's a tendency to invest all your vicarious virtue in the clergy person. And we do this in the black church, but there's a tendency to say, I may be a scoundrel, I may be a scuzzbucket, I may be terrible, two-timing, this, that, and the other. But all the virtue I aspire to and all the virtue that I might have had but don't have, Reverend has it. So you put the clergyman in this sort of ideal position. It's the opposite of scapegoating. Scapegoating, you put your sins on somebody and then beat them to death. The opposite of it, you put all the virtues that you don't have on somebody and expect them to be good for you. And so when they're not good for you, in fact, when they're just as bad as you are, it's a double disappointment. One, they're bad because they're bad. They did something that they should not have done. But two, they're bad and therefore have deprived you of that vicarious virtue. And that is at that point where you get angry. It's that point where people react in such a way that they want the vital parts of the person who has betrayed them in that sense. And so you begin to doubt whether virtue can adhere anyway. If he can't be good, what can possibly happen to me and to the rest of my people? So there is a kind of trauma that is introduced there. The rabbi in New Jersey who hired a hitman to kill his wife because he didn't like her. That's a rather extreme way of settling a domestic difficulty, and he was convicted in the courts. And there were people glad to be rid of him. There are other people who were immediately prepared to say, well, they never did get along, I suppose, and in the long run, you know, forgive and forget, and let's reconcile and get back with it. That's what Bonhoeffer would call a cheap form of grace. There is a tendency to cheap forgiveness, for the very reason that I have just suggested. We need somebody to be good for us. And since I'm not prepared to assume the mantle of goodness any more than anybody else, let's get Reverend back where he was before and just hope for the best. The people of our Abyssinian Church forgave Adam Clayton Powell over and over and over again. He was a glorious scoundrel. Everybody knew it. And he sort of played off it. But that church loved him. And they forgave him, and I think he had an effective ministry, but it was a pathological relationship, I think. And there are many cases where there is such a pathological relationship. I think it really depresses people when they see somebody in whom they have invested great moral authority, proven to have less than that moral authority. It reflects not only on the person, but it reflects on those of us who have invested in that person. I mean, that's my nickel analysis of the Clinton scandals. That the reason that people, at least many people, were so upset with Bill Clinton, not the Clinton haters, that's another category entirely, but the people who, by and large, liked Bill Clinton or trusted him, felt betrayed because he was, as President of the United States, he's supposed to be good for us, not just good for himself. He's supposed to be good for us. So when he's bad for himself, and his sins were personal sins, I don't think they were public or corporate sins at all. They were personal sins. They reflected on us, and we were terribly annoyed and disappointed. Some said, I told you so, and let's do the bastard in. Others said, he's the best that we've got, but boy, am I hurt, I'm disappointed, and how stupid to squander my invested virtue in that way. It's like squandering money that you gave to somebody. He squandered the moral capital that people had given him. And so the malaise that set in after that is illustrative of this point. We lost our confidence, and to a certain degree, we will never fully trust anybody quite again. We want to trust this president. I mean, there are many liabilities that this president brings to the table. They're manifest, and I can give you a long list of them. But one of the reasons we did invest in him is that not because he was bright, but because we believed him to be good. And I believe that he is good. I don't believe he's bright, but I do believe he's good. And if there are manifestations that trust is misplaced or misused or in some sense abused, this is why the worst crime a president can commit is to lie to the people. And if it's demonstrated that that happens, that moral capital that we've invested has been squandered, and we feel that we have, in fact, been betrayed. Trust has been broken, and you can never quite put it back again. It's Humpty Dumpty. So I think it's both secular and ecclesiastical, and every time it's violated, you have to reconstruct. Long answer, but that.